One, two, three, four, five. Okay, do you want to get me?
So I think we might, like, should we at 5:02, you do your little bit and I can do my introduction. And I know it's early, but the room's full, so
And exactly.
we can do that.
So by the time we finish the outer, then it probably will be 1 o'clock. So as soon as let's see if we're going to miss.
So let's just give you, like, let's start at 11:55. You can do your talk, and then I'll do my little introduction. And this gentleman says he has a seat saved, but he keeps wandering around looking for his saved seat. He keeps hoping one of the seats will come up.
Just
Would it preserve one of the seats suggested at the beginning?
This is really ugly.
good afternoon. For the people who are not seated, there's a couple of seats here by the piano, but that's it. We can't have anyone standing in the room. I think people are familiar with this exercise. Before the introduction to Tommy Banks, I'm Joanna Miazga. I'm the chair of the Noon Hour Committee. On behalf of the committee members, I would like to say to all of you, thank you very much for your attendance to the presentation. The presentations, pardon me. We have received a lot of positive feedback from you. You do have the evaluations that came as part of your initial registration kit. And so please take the time to fill in and let us give us your feedback. And if you have any recommendations, we welcome them, but please make sure that you have a name and contact information so that we don't just have, sorry, I forgot about the mic for the other rooms. So we don't just have an idea, but we have background to that idea. So we can find the same people you may be thinking about. But that being said, thank you very much. We've enjoyed your presence at these presentations.
You'll notice we're starting a little early today, and that's so we can give Tommy as much time as possible to talk, and the room is full. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Tommy Banks. Tommy was born in Calgary and lives here in Edmonton. He showed his musical talent at a very young age and has been involved in almost every facet of Canada's entertainment scene ever since. I have a few highlights of his illustrious career. He's hosted nationally and internationally syndicated television programs, including his own, The Tommy Banks Show. He's provided musical direction for ceremonies such as the Commonwealth Games, the World University Games, the Olympic Winter Games, and a command performance for Her Majesty the Queen. He was appointed to the Senate in 2000, where he served for over 11 years. He's a recipient of many awards, and there's lots of them if you look at online. So I'm just going to highlight a few. He received a Juno Award for his jazz, a Gemini Award, the Grand Prix d'Isques Canada, and he's also a member of the Alberta Order of Excellence and is an officer of the Order of Canada. I could go on and on, but Tommy asked me to keep it short because he wants to spend as much time as he can talking to you today and also answering his any questions you have for him. But I want to tell you a little bit what we've asked him to speak to us about today. His topic is Jazz City, and that's a subject, of course, which he's very well versed. He made his jazz playing debut in 1950 in the touring band of saxophonist Don Thompson. And since then, he's played and conducted jazz throughout North America and around the world. And I think you were 14, was it, when you made your professional debut? In 1983, his quintet became the first jazz band to tour in continental China since the 1949 revolution. And he's appeared with many jazz greats in clubs, concert halls, on radio and television, and he continues to perform. And maybe some of you have caught him playing recently and conducting. I know I did just the other month as part of the Yardbird Suite celebrations. And it was a wonderful presentation, and our jazz presentation, and I'm sure his lecture today will be as well. Please join me in a warm welcome for Tommy Banks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Leslie. Is this on? Okay. I didn't understand. I thought I was going to be sitting around a table with 6 or 7 people. And since we're not sitting, when I'm standing, I usually move around a lot, but I can't because I have been admonished that this microphone, not this microphone, this microphone is necessary in order that we can be heard and seen by some people in another room, because this one is full, for which I thank you very much. That's a great compliment. I have to point out that, speaking of Ella, that this is Ella Fitzgerald, this would be Ella Fitzgerald's 100th birthday this year. And so she's, depending on your point of view, she is either the best or the second best jazz singer that there ever was. Those people who think that Sassy was Sarah Vaughan it's a contest between the two that has been going on with jazz aficionados for decades. Jazz aficionados of that kind are the snootiest of all music people. They make classical snobs look like amateurs. I I've been asked by Leslie to speak about Jazz City, which is a very specific subject. This was in the jazz community, the international jazz community. Edmonton was known as Jazz City for a few years. It isn't anymore. And it's to deal with the facts alone. It was coined along with we were the City of Champions. We will, I think, again, I hope, be the City of Champions. We should be. By a man named Mark Vasey, to whom we owe a great deal. Mark Vasey was a good musician. He played trumpet well, and he played in a band that accompanied Big Miller, a lot of times traveling all over the world and doing that. But Mark became the president and chief executive officer of the Edmonton Jazz Society at a point a long time ago. And in 1980, because he was entrepreneurial as well, he established the Edmonton International Jazz Festival. That's the same year that the Montreal International Jazz Festival was formed. So we were the two first international jazz festivals in Canada were Montreal and Edmonton. Edmonton's was bigger in that year. There were 7 presentations in the Montreal Festival, and there were 20 in the Edmonton Festival, which was soon internationally renowned, and people loved to come here and play because it was so well run by Mark Vasey, and of course by the volunteers that make everything in our city work. We wouldn't have anything going on in many of the areas of arts and culture writ large if it weren't for our volunteer cadre, of which I'm sure many of you are a part, for which all of us thank you. So Mark coined the term Jazz City early on, and I don't know if you remember this, but at the airport, the newsstand, the international airport, used to actually say Jazz City, so people got off and knew that was the case. And it was called that for as long as the Edmonton Jazz Society ran that aspect of the Edmonton, what was then called the Jazz City Festival. But it's a name, an appellation that Edmonton well deserves, because with jazz music and with every other kind of music and with every other kind of performing art and other arts as well, the graphic arts as well, Edmonton has always, I hate this phrase, but punched above its weight. You know what I mean by that. It has always had activity in those areas, and excellent high levels of activity in those areas, far beyond the proportion that you would think in a city of our size. That's always been the case. I set out a few years ago to find out why that was so. And as far back as you can go in the existing records and in the archives of both the city and the province and other private archives, it is the case that Edmonton has had arts activity, music, art, drama, theater, dance, etc., out of all proportion to its size relative to other cities in the world. There must have been a Joe Schachter or a Francis Winspear or something far back to whom this could be attributed. But as far back as the records go, that is the case. A good example of that is that there is a program of the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra as it was in 1927. 1927, the principal supporter and sponsor of which was Dr. Francis Winspear. In 1927, he wasn't Dr. Francis Winspear then, he was simply Francis Winspear. So our punching above our weight in music goes back a long way, and that's true in jazz in particular. The jazz history in Edmonton that's recorded and available in the archives goes back to the early 1920s. And when you think of the fact that jazz only existed from the early times of the 20th century, it's just about 100 years old in any sense that we would recognize jazz to be jazz. Edmonton has been there in a sense and in a proportion out of all proportion to its size. I did some research in that respect and looked up some things from a book by Mark Miller, and I'm going to refer to some of them. By the way, Leslie asked me about questions. I always say that I'm always happy to take questions about any subject at all, as long as you're prepared to accept I have no idea is the answer. So please interrupt with questions. I'll try to leave some time when we get there too to have questions, because those are the discussion that goes on. That'll be the best part of the day for me, at least. But please interrupt if you have a question or if I say something that raises a question. But I want to take you back to Edmonton in a time that not even the oldest among us here will remember. In 1920, on February the 20th, 1920, the Lewis Brothers Annex opened in Edmonton in what was then called the Bell Building on 101st Street, just north of Jasper Avenue. It was a basement cabaret which featured jazz music. According to the Edmonton Journal of the day, it boasted 78 tables and a particularly florid decor. The entire floor is laid in, this is from the Journal Review of that cabaret. The entire floor is laid in maple and the decorations are carried out in a rich color scheme of green and rose. The walls have been fronted by green trellis work, artistically overhung with purple wisteria. Dainty electric lights in the walls and ceiling with rose-colored shades make a lovely lighting effect, and a colored jazz band has been secured from Chicago to supply the best music. We could say those things in those days, I guess. That club, which obviously was pretty elaborate for a jazz club, became called the Alhambra in 1922, and the Alhambra in turn was renamed the Palais de Danse in 1924, but it was short-lived and would soon be supplemented by a place called Sullivan's in the La Flèche building. Now, some of you will remember this. The La Flèche building on 102nd Street, just south of Jasper Avenue on the east side of 102nd Street. The La Flèche building. All those who remember the La Flèche building? A few. Sullivan's became the city's most popular night spot. An important person in music and in jazz in particular in Edmonton in those days was a man named Shirley Oliver, Mr. Shirley Oliver. He was formerly the pianist with Charles Dock Cook's orchestra in Chicago, a renowned jazz band. And he was not one of the mostly anonymous Chicago musicians who played at Sullivan's and in other clubs in Edmonton in those days. He arrived in Edmonton in 1920. The circumstances of his arrival as mysterious as those of his departure. He remained in Edmonton through the decade and for several years later, and he played in Edmonton's leading white dance band, a not uncommon instance in Alberta during the 1920s, if scarcely anywhere else. That didn't happen in most places in North America at that time, in the 1920s, of black and white musicians working together. It would be another 20 years before Teddy Wilson broke the color barrier with the Benny Goodman Band in the United States. Shirley Oliver and his family settled quickly into the black community that made up a small portion of Edmonton's then 60,000 residents. 1,000 or more American black people, many of them Oklahomans, facing disenfranchisement from the former territory when it attained statehood, had responded to the Canadian government's appeal for settlers. And they arrived in around 1910 in the new area called Pine Creek, which is now called Amber Valley, northeast of Edmonton, a place called Junkins, which is now called Wildwood, and Keystone, which is now called Breton. Mr. Oliver himself took work as a porter on the railway to supplement his income from playing and teaching piano. He also traveled as an itinerant projectionist into northern communities, showing movies where they had rarely been seen before. By April 1922, Shirley Oliver was able to buy a home for his family in the Parkdale neighborhood on the city's north side, which was noted approvingly by the Reverend George Slater, the pastor of the new Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. That covers everything. There were at least two other black American musicians living in Edmonton during the early 1920s. One was a clarinetist named Bob Everly. He had traveled in the mid-1910s with the Rabbit Foot Minstrels and the Silas Green from New Orleans tent show. The other, Ernest Braxton, was a drummer and tightrope artist who may have been affiliated at some point with a famous traveling company called the Famous Georgia Minstrels. Everly, like Oliver, was a member of the AME Church, and the two professors played for many of its social functions over the years. Everly was back in Edmonton for the fall season at the Alhambra Cabaret with a band called the Doodad Jazz Fiends, a sextet led by erstwhile Plaza drummer N.Z. Morgan. The band was filled out by white musicians, the trombonist Victor Teasdale, the saxophonist Tom Goodridge, the pianist Art Fleming, who some of you may remember, and the banjo player Dutch Lyons. Does anybody remember Lyons Motors on 101st Street, on the west side of 101st Street, north of Kingsway? It was a big two-story building. It was an elaborate building. Well, its owner was Dutch Lyons, who was a really good banjo player. We used to go to sessions in the early 1950s in his very elaborate man cave on the second floor above his auto dealership. On October the 11th, 1922, the Doodads were heard from the studio of Journal radio station, as it was then, CJCA, in a 45-minute broadcast that included The Sneak, Sensation, Take It 'Cause It's All Yours, and of course, The Tiger Rag, as well as a Doodad original called The Barrel House Blues. The Doodads were followed on CJCA 2 weeks later by Shirley Oliver's new band, which was called Gump's Jazz Hounds, with Ernest Braxton, with the cornetist Paul Poston, and the banjo player Frank Birch. The reason I'm mentioning all this is to show you that as far back as you can go, there is graphic physical evidence, including photographs of jazz in Edmonton as early as it was anywhere in North America. The Hounds, which are described in the Edmonton Journal Review as the only colored dance band this side of Winnipeg, were certainly one of the earliest jazz groups in Canada, made up of resident rather than traveling musicians. On October the 25th, they entertained radio listeners in Northern Alberta with a selection of tunes that included the current jazz hits Royal Garden Blues, Stumbling, Nobody Lied, The Gypsy Blues, and Everybody's Step. That broadcast predated by nearly 8 months the appearance of Herb Thomas and his famous Chicago Novelty Orchestra on CKAC in Montreal. So Edmonton broadcasters were broadcasting live jazz in the early 1920s. Graydon W. Tip was one of the many white jazz bands in Edmonton. Received his early training in the Edmonton Journal Newsboys Band. What was Mike's last name? Mike's Newsstand. He started the Edmonton and paid for the Edmonton Journal Newsboys Band. In the fall of 1922, Mr. Graydon Tip, who was a saxophonist, formed a 6-piece orchestra for dances at a place called the Carlton Hall. And by October 1923, when his Midnight Rounders filled in on short notice for an American act who had gone missing for a show at the Pantages Theatre. Does everybody know where the Pantages Theatre was? The Pantages Theatre became the Strand Theatre on Jasper Avenue, right across from the old Hudson's Bay store. So an American act didn't show up one day at the Pantages, as it was then called, and Shirley Oliver was at the piano with that band on that day. Many musicians passed through Graydon Tip's band over the next several years. The only one who was constant in that band was Shirley Oliver. And Tip kept his musicians fully employed well into 1929 when it hit the fan. His band worked most summers at the Riverview Pavilion in Edmonton, which looked out over the North Saskatchewan River from 109th Street, and took extended engagements variously at Sullivan's, which was a little flesh building on 102nd Street, and the King Edward Hotel. Anybody remember the King Edward Hotel? Used to have music in the King Edward Hotel, and local theaters at other times of the year. There's a picture of Graydon Tip and his Riverview Pavilion Orchestra in 1925 in the Provincial Archives of Alberta. The Journal critic, in those days, critics signed their names only with initials. This critic was called HMB. He wrote that Tip and his musicians appeared at the Rialto Theatre in a concert, were loudly applauded in all numbers, but especially encored in the livelier, red-hot species of jazz. Jazz at the Rialto. Everybody remember the Rialto Theatre? With Tip's orchestra providing a reliable income in 19... 1922, Shirley Oliver was finally able to forgo his job on the railway as a porter, and in 1926 he opened his own music studio downtown on Jasper Avenue. Such were his rising fortunes that in 1927 he made a return visit to Chicago, and he made the trip home in his Studebaker Big Six sedan. Ernest Braxton, who I had mentioned earlier, a resident good jazz musician in Edmonton, his first venture was probably a vaudeville act with a partner named Jones, and they were called Jazz and Joker, and they played in the vaudeville theaters in those days. And they appeared at the Rialto Theater in April of 1927. 2 months later, he returned with a full band called the Moonlight Syncopators. Jazz bands in those days all had to have those kinds of names. The trumpeter Ollie Wagner, with whom I had a chance to play many times. The saxophonist Frank Sclove, with whom I had a chance to play many times. Frank died maybe 8 or 10 years ago. He played in the Edmonton Symphony, as well as in Frank McLeavy's band at the McDonald Hotel. So the Moonlight Syncopators with Ollie Wagner playing trumpet and Frank Sclove playing saxophone, with a violinist named Seward Poston, the pianist named Josephine Barzy, and the banjo player Carl Green, appeared at the Rialto Theater, and there's a picture in the Archives of Alberta of that band too. 5 black musicians and Frank Sclove, who was a white musician, playing together that early, again, way before that color barrier was broken in the United States. For Frank Sclove, who was then only 15 years old, and a member of the Edmonton Newsboys Band, the Syncopators' only white musician, the Rialto engagement marked the start of a career that lasted for Frank well into the 1990s. After a successful audition by telephone, Braxton's Moonlight Syncopators moved for the rest of the summer to the Lakeview, or the Alexandra Pavilion at Sylvan Lake. That preceded the Prom Ballroom and the Varsity Hall. The trumpet was Ollie Wagner. Now, Ollie Wagner was an Edmontonian who was famous all over North America as a jazz musician. His first instrument was the trumpet, but the instrument on which he played the best was the saxophone, mainly the tenor saxophone. I had a chance to play several times with Ollie Wagner, and it was a delight. He was as good as anybody. He was not recorded, sadly, during a career that spanned 6 decades, leaving only the descriptions offered by his fellow musicians to document his style and, by all accounts, his considerable skill. He played classic swing-era tenor saxophone. Like Coleman Hawkins, one critic observed, only maybe a little better. There were several social occasions in the black communities in and around Edmonton that called for musician services, picnics and other church services and functions, dances and holiday celebrations. At the same time, his early work, Ollie Wagner's early work with Ernest Braxton in 1927 at the Rialto Theater and at Sylvan Lake would have opened his eyes to the opportunities that existed outside the black community, opportunities that would need to be explored further if he were to make his music his career. He initially had success as a singer on radio station CFRN, where he was introduced as the Lark of the Air. He also worked occasionally for Louis Biamonte, an Italian band leader. Remember Tony Biamonte? Louis was Tony's father. And he employed another black musician, Wagner's brother-in-law, Joe Boyd, on a regular basis at a place called the Palace Gardens. After Wagner's example, Joe Boyd played both trumpet and saxophone and was also an arranger. In fact, Boyd may have been the first of many musicians that Wagner taught, formally or informally, over the next 20 years, in some cases simply to fill an empty chair in one of his bands. In 1934, Ollie Wagner formed a band called the Knights of Harlem and went on the road. Back in Edmonton in the fall of 1936, He watched as the city's first Canadian-born black musicians came of age. Some had already started their careers, including a teenaged Elnora Proctor, who was singing on CFRN. But her stage name was Eleanor Collins. Remember Eleanor Collins? She was a CBC radio and TV favorite when she was residing in Vancouver in the 1950s and 60s. Eleanor Collins was she's still alive, fortunately. She's a wonderful singer. In the late 1960s, I had the opportunity of playing a couple of jazz concerts with Ollie Wagner. One was in the Wedgwood Room of the Hotel Macdonald. This was before the Yardbird Suite had been established. No, yeah, it was just before the Yardbird Suite had been established, and was reviewed in the Journal. He was a fabulous player. Ollie Wagner was a star anywhere. In the early 50s, I played at what was the name of the ballroom? The Rainbow Ballroom, with a band called Billy Boyer and his Knights of Rhythm. And the best musician in that band was Joe Boyd. He was the star of that band. He was an extraordinarily good player and arranger. Two of Boyd's sons, Bernie and Barry Boyd, who strangely did not become instrumental musicians, formed a dance act called the Boyd Brothers, which was one of the featured acts in Don Thompson's musical review of 1952, a bus and truck show that toured all over the Western Canada, led by Don Thompson. The acts featured the vocalist, that show featured the vocalist Shelley Fletcher, the song and dance duo of Vogel and Kerr, Barry Vogel and Johnny Kerr. Barry became a very distinguished lawyer, but he was a song and dance man at that point. And you gotta my first job was playing in that band, and it was, as Leslie told you, when I was 14, and we toured all over Western Canada, and jazz was the sort of conventional popular music of the day, because rock hadn't happened yet, and most dance music in those days, in the 1940s and 50s and even the early 60s, was sort of jazz oriented. It wasn't jazz, but it was jazz-ish. By the late 1930s, Edmonton's black musicians had organized themselves into two bands. Jesse Jones formed a band called the Harlem Aces with his wife Ruth at the piano. Bert Proctor, who was Elnora Proctor's, that is to say Eleanor Collins's elder brother, was on guitar. Ida Proctor, Bert's wife, was at the drums, and Eddie Bailey played the trombone. Bert Proctor was the band's arranger, and like Ollie Wagner, a figure of some influence locally. He later led the Swingsters, a family band in Calgary. Tiger Ace Bailey, meanwhile, established in Edmonton the Knights of Swing with Joe Boyd and Vern King, the guitarist Gene Lang, the drummer Mel Crump, and summoned from the coast Lionel Mitchell. The Knights of Swing were the better band of the two and enjoyed greater success, eventually working downtown at the Cameo Cabaret on Jasper Avenue. We used to have a lot of cabarets in Edmonton. The Aces' engagements were rather more modest. I'll quote Bailey. He said, "We used to go out into the country 40 or 50 miles out and play little dance gigs. We didn't get as good jobs as the Knights of Swing. They were making $7 a week each at the Cameo. We played the exhibition one week in Edmonton down near the CPR station for $1.50 for the whole week." But $7 a week in those days was not bad money. So the convention of jazz as the basis for popular music, dance music, lasted from the 1920s until early in the 1960s. And again, Edmonton was always out of all proportion in terms of activity in jazz music of all kinds in all that time. When I first moved here, when I was dragged here kicking and screaming by my family from Calgary, because I was 13, didn't want to lose all my friends and people that I knew and the family that we had there. it was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me because in those days there was a huge cultural gap between Calgary and Edmonton. There was a lot going on in Calgary. My father was a semi-professional musician in Calgary, and my mother was in the theater in Calgary. But when we moved to Edmonton, it was like moving from Mars to Venus, because there was so much musical activity here at a level that I had never experienced before, I'd never seen before. And it is that fact that gave me the opportunity, the great good fortune, the good luck to begin playing early on, and I'm still doing it. Yes, sir. I have to refer back to the thing I said right at the very beginning. The question was, why was there so much more activity here? That's why. That's as good a reason as any. I have never been able to figure out why that is so. People who have been interested in why that was so and again, I stress it was in all of the performing and graphic and hard arts, have tried to find out why. I think that it made a lot of people have tried to explain it by saying that the population here was always more cosmopolitan. Calgary was a very British city, British/American city. Edmonton had a much larger European population and they brought with it the European appreciation for and insistence on involvement in the arts of all kinds. I don't know whether that is a logical explanation, but the fact is that however far back you go, that difference was there. Now, I have to say that gap has in every case narrowed, and in some cases closed, and in some cases gone the other way, because Calgary has come alive, particularly since the late 1960s, and that gap has closed. But in those early days, the difference was palpable and very considerable. In that, I was able to make a living, and many other musicians were able to make a living in Edmonton. That just didn't happen in Calgary. Yes, ma'am. Sorry, sir. That's probably true. Did you hear that? That Louis Cardinal said that Edmonton has always been the meeting place. That's probably true. As far back as you go, there is evidence of music being played here at Fort Edmonton, and there's writing about that. It wouldn't have been jazz, unless it was accidentally jazz. Jazz musicians will tell you that if you make a mistake, the point is to make it again immediately, and then people will think you meant it the first time. So I don't know the answer to the question, but it is no longer that disparity doesn't exist anymore. But it did at the time, and I'm very grateful for the fact that it did, because it gave me a sort of 20-year head start on being able to make a living playing. Another very important thing happened in Alberta, but Edmonton was better equipped to take advantage of it, musically speaking. You may remember that until 1960, Alberta was a dry province. You could buy liquor in the government liquor stores, a very limited choice, but you could buy liquor. But you could not take your wife. By the way, say hello to my wife, Ida, who's sitting right there. I could not take you for a drink in a bar, because there was no such thing. I could not buy you a glass of wine at dinner in a restaurant, because that was not allowed, until January the 1st, 1960. And there was, I don't know if you remember this, but there was an explosion of music in Edmonton. Much of it jazz-based and rock-based in the early 1960s. Out of all proportion to its size, and far more than any other city in the West. And there's a reason for that. there's an interesting reason. It's an inadvertent good thing that was done by a government. In those days, liquor sales and licensing was all handled by a thing was called the Alberta Liquor Control Board. It doesn't exist anymore. It's now folded into gaming and all those other things. But the Alberta Liquor Control Board were wise in the sense that they understood that they had not, that the ban on liquor being consumed in restaurants and the like was lifted on January the 1st, 1960. And the members of the ALCB recognized that they were inexperienced in respect of how to manage this, how to do licensing. And in those days, if you applied for a liquor license, which I did, for a restaurant, for example, they would determine whether they approved of the wallpaper or the covering on the chairs or the carpet or the choice of cutlery that you made. Everything was approved down to the nines by the Alberta Liquor Control Board. They also recognized that they didn't want to constrain the growth of that industry, and so they made a very inadvertent but wise decision. They said, if you have a licensed dining lounge, which is what nightclubs were called in those days, you have to stop serving liquor at 12 o'clock every day, unless you have at least a 3-piece band. In which case you can serve liquor until 2 o'clock. So most restaurant operators, not being blindly stupid, started hiring musicians 6 nights a week. And the result was an influx of musicians into Alberta, but Edmonton in particular, that outweighed every other place in the country. And that is one of the reasons that we have such a very significant cultural mass of musicians in Edmonton. That's still the holdover from those days. That advantage is now gone, but it was a very important one. Yes? Well, the trouble is that they obviated the advantage, and now everybody can stay open with 2 o'clock, and you have VLT machines instead of a trio. That boom led to a lot of things in Edmonton. It led to the growth of the recording industry, the television production industry. I don't know if you remember, we used to do a lot of television production in Edmonton of music and other things as well. How are we doing? Oh, we have to stop. Because we have to go for questions. Now, I will happily answer any questions that you have about any subject at all. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Oh, yeah. Everybody remember the Trocadero? The Trocadero, all of the major vaudeville companies, circuits, had big theaters in Edmonton. The Keith Circuit, the Orpheum Circuit, and the Pantages Circuit. The Keith Circuit Theater in Edmonton was called, it was on 103rd Street, north of Jasper Avenue, the Empire Theater. Who said that? You remember? Good. The Empire Theater. Good. It was a gorgeous theater of the old, carved plaster ceilings and a gorgeous theater. It closed down just before the war because because theaters had fallen on hard times. That was true of all of the theaters in Edmonton, the Pantages, the Rialto, all of whom had live shows. When Bob Lyon, who was from Edmonton, his real name was Robert Lyon Rutherford, joined the war effort, he became the musical and entertainment director for General MacArthur in the Southeast Asia Theater of War, and formed a band called Bob Lyon and his Serenade in Blue, which played at a place called the Trocadero in Sydney, Australia. When he came back to Edmonton after the war, he and a man named John Falkenberg bought the building that had housed the Empire Theatre, which was called the Tower Building at one point. You may unhappily remember the Tower Building because it's where the tax department had its offices. And they turned the Empire Theatre into a gorgeous nightclub. If you can imagine a nightclub from a Hollywood 1938 era movie, that's what the Trocadero was like. They kept the balcony, of course, from the theater. It was a beautiful place when it opened with, the little round tables with the white tablecloths right up to the court. The opening act was the Mills Brothers. Not bad. And it had about a 70-foot ceiling because, of course, it had been this gorgeous theater. The Trocadero was a gorgeous ballroom/nightclub when it first opened. And it was Bob Lyon and his Serenade in Blue who was the band there for many years, followed by bands led by Harry Boone, Chuck Barber, Jack Winterton, and the last one. I'll think of it in a little while. But it went from nightclub, classy nightclub, to ballroom, of which there are many in Edmonton. And then it became a dance hall, and then it became a bingo parlor, and then But ballrooms used to be the center of all social activity in Edmonton. There was the Rainbow Ballroom, the Starland Ballroom, the Trocadero, the Skyline Ballroom, which was out near the airport, the Tivoli Ballroom, can't remember where that was, but there were 5 or 6 ballrooms in Edmonton, all of which employed musicians 6 nights a week. When the ballrooms went away, that's when the nightclubs came into being. There had always been nightclubs in Edmonton, even before January 1st, 1960. Most of them had been just outside the city. You remember the Club Macombo on the route to St. Albert? Remember the Club Embassy in what was then called Beverly? And Chick's Barbecue, which was on the Calgary Highway. It was out of town. Now it would be right downtown practically. Here's an interesting fact. In 1964, within 1 block of Jasper Avenue, between 100th Street and 109th Street, there were 17 nightclubs, each of which employed at least one band 6 nights a week, and most of whom had 4 shows as well. That was the beginning of that boom time that lasted in the 60s and 70s and lasted until the early 1980s. And that's when Edmonton really became Jazz City, as Mark Vasey named it. So that's where the word came from. We owe it to Mark Vasey, who is also the guy who engineered the establishment of the Artbridge Suite in 1957. 56? 57. So we owe him a great deal, and I think he's still around. I hope so. Maybe in Victoria, but he is the guy who originated the term Jazz City, and for those years it was appropriate. But as we see from that historical fact, it was almost always appropriate to call Edmonton Jazz City. Time for a few more questions about jazz or anything else. Yes, ma'am. Musical theater, yes. Yes. The question was, can we talk about musical theater? We're well served now by professional theater in Edmonton, but before Joe Schachter established professional theater in Edmonton, which he did, there was semi-professional and amateur theater. And the groups in those days that performed it, I'm talking about the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, were the Edmonton Opera Company, which was run by Auntie Van Carmichael, if I recall correctly. And they presented grand opera, usually at the Strand Theatre. Then there was the Edmonton Light Opera Company, which was run by Herbert and Eileen Turner. They were the people who produced the Broadway musicals that played here, usually also at the Strand. And then when it was opened up at what's now called the Eva O. Howard Theatre, which was the Victoria Composite High School Theatre, a very good theatre. that was the best we had in those days. There were two variety producing companies that produced musical reviews on stage. One was called Varieties. It was sponsored by the Edmonton Parks and Recreation Commission. And its first director was Marie Wills, and she was succeeded by Jack Unwin. They presented 2 shows a year. And then there was Orion Musical Theatre, which was Dasha Goody's creation, and also presented 2 shows a year. First at the Jubilee Auditorium, then at the Citadel for years. And that morphed into and sort of became Edmonton Musical Theatre, which is still going and teaching young people musical theatre. So we've always punched above our weight in that respect too, as well as in drama without music. You had a question. The question was talking about music education in Edmonton or anywhere in Alberta. The trouble, if I get started on that, it'll take me an hour and a half. Music should be, despite its cost and inconvenience, a core subject in the schools, which it once was. The studies that prove the efficacy of music education, the earlier the better, in schools and otherwise, are so large now and so complete, and the methodology so irrefutably correct that it cannot be denied that the effect of music education in schools upon the lives of the students, not just on it affects their academic performance, but it affects their lives. It makes them more confident. The best example you can see of that is if you go home, please Google, if you have a computer, Google a thing called El Sistema, ELSISTEMA. It's going on in Venezuela, which is having some difficulties these days, but it is a state-run music program that was designed to help stop the ever downward spiral of drugs, prostitution, gangs, criminology that happened in the barrios in that country. The then president of Venezuela impaneled a group of experts, sociologists, policemen, teachers, doctors, medical people, to find a way to stop that downward spiral. And they looked at it a number of different ways, including sports and all kinds of other things. They settled upon music, not as a music program to turn out lots of musicians, but as a social program to empower those people to break that downward spiral. And it absolutely works. It is a virtual miracle. It has been applied in other places. We have El Sistema in Edmonton now with Yona, the youth orchestra of Northern Alberta, established by the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra and which club? Rotary, and the various school boards, which ought to be supported. But the arguments are so strong in favor of it that it boggles those of us who have been making this argument that curriculum development officers and school boards and trustees and principals, and sometimes that's where the decision resides, do not respond to it. And I understand the reasons why. It's expensive, it takes a lot of time, and it's inconvenient by comparison with other things that we're shoveling through the pipe. But it's a long-held view of mine and all of my colleagues that there ought to be music education as a core subject in the public school systems. And I hope that you will agitate for that wherever you find it. It's out of tune. I checked. I've spent a lot of time in this room because we used to do summer jazz camps at the university, and many of the concerts and classes took place in this room. That piano has never been in tune. It was out of tune the day they bought it. Yes, sir.
It's a different subject, but you might have a question on anything. How did you find your time in the Senate?
Did you say, how did I find it? It was the greatest learning experience ever. The Senate gets a bad rap because, of course, we hear about the occasional bad apple. Incidentally, when you're reading stories about the possibility of that most recent senator, whose name I can't remember, being booted, having been precedent setting, that's not true. Many senators have been expelled from the Senate in the past by the Senate, which is its own master, for malfeasance of one kind or another, and usually an indictable offense of some kind. Sometimes wrongly, but it's certainly not that uncommon. The Senate is a wonderful ornament to the Canadian parliamentary system. It is it's hard to explain why in the 21st century in a democracy we have a completely undemocratic institution as the senior house in Parliament, but there are good reasons for that, which it would take me an hour to go into them. The Senate does a lot of good for Canada, which most people don't know, and makes laws which are being proposed a lot better than they would otherwise be, and protects us in many ways. We hear about the bad apples, and we don't hear about the good works in the Senate. But in answer to your question, it was the greatest learning experience of my life, which I wish everybody could have, because my colleagues and I all sit there every day in committees, which is where the heavy lifting is done in the Senate, not in the chamber, saying about whatever the subject is, I didn't think about that before, or I've never understood that point of view before, or I didn't know that. It's a learning process by which people who are from all walks of life learn the things. They aren't experts, but they learn from experts, which helps them make our laws better, because the Senate makes many amendments to laws which are proposed by the government, either introduced in the Senate or in the House of Commons before they become law, including a couple that I wrote. So it was a wonderful experience, and I wish that everybody could have it. And I'm very glad to see that these days the Senate is in the business of fixing itself and improving itself in ways that only it can do. It cannot be done by others or otherwise. So the part I didn't like about being in the Senate was leaving on the plane every Monday morning and coming home on Friday night for 40 weeks a year. I didn't like that part very much, but it was a great privilege to have the learning experience that I did in those 11 years, 8 months, 4 days, and that's it. The question was, do I have a preference as to how senators should be selected? No, I think it's going in the right direction. People now apply to become senators. Those applications are vetted by a group of very distinguished people, and we all know who they are, and we can watch the process, and then they're selected for a recommendation by the Prime Minister to the Governor General for appointment. I think that's as good a way as to do it as any. It's certainly better than the previous ways, which were arcane and nobody knew what they were. That being said, there have not been that many bad appointments to the Senate, but the present process, which is more like the process by which people are named to the federal courts, is better than the non-system that existed before. So I think that the Canadians being able to apply to be named to the Senate, the vetting process that they undergo, and the filtering that gets the list shortened down to a very short list, and the selection finally being made, is as good a way as any. I think that we will very soon be able to see the positive results of that, because pretty soon there will be a majority of independent senators in the Senate, which is good. So I like it. I like the way it is. Yes, ma'am. it looks funny. Yeah. The lady is saying that I think it's sort of inspired by El Sistema. The Paraguayans have also developed a social program based around music. And the purpose of both these programs, is important to remember, is not to turn out 500 new oboe players this week. We don't need that. It is to give people self-confidence and certainty about their future and a reason for. Most important thing those programs is social interdependence. The problem with young people who get into trouble is that they have not learned social interdependence because they've never been able to rely on anybody, and nobody has ever been able to rely on them for anything or required to be like them. So Paraguay and Venezuela have found that the best way to bring that about is a highly condensed music program. The difference in Paraguay is that they make their instruments from whatever they find in the junkyard. So the orchestras that you will hear in that program sound wonderful, but they look funny because they'll be playing a violin made out of an old gasoline tin. But it works, and it's a wonderful program. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yeah. Yes. Vanessa Rodriguez, UEZ on the end, is from Edmonton. Her father was an architect. Her mother used to run the children's bookstore at, not Audrey's, the one on the south side, Greenwoods. And Vanessa is an expert jazz organist, really superb. But she also plays the violin. And she moved to Rio de Janeiro and started a kids' music program in the barrio along the same lines. But the difference is that instead of being state-sponsored, she does it on her own. And you can all contribute to it if you look up Vanessa Rodriguez, Rio de Janeiro. Consider $5. It would help her a lot because she's doing this all on her own. Yes, ma'am. Sorry. Yeah, you should go see them. The kids in Yona, from the inner city music program, El Sistema based in Edmonton, are performing with the symphony at the Winspear in a concert in June. And it's well worth going to see them. Ida and I have watched that program from the very beginning. At the very beginning of that program, the kids they all make a cardboard violin, so that they learn how to hold it properly and how to deal with it and how to put it away. And then after they've done that, after a while, they actually get their little violins. And you should have seen, we were both crying. You should have seen the look on their faces when they actually get a violin, a real violin, which costs some money, but people are doing this. It's a wonderful thing. You should go to that concert in June if you can, at the Winspear, and hear these children come out and play. And by the way, if you want a real musical treat, when you Google El Sistema, look at one of their many. There are 200 youth orchestras in Venezuela, but the biggest one is called I can't remember, but you'll find it, and you'll watch this orchestra that sounds like the Chicago Symphony, and they're children playing this fantastic music. It's amazing. Yes, sir. The next Tommy Banks concert we're doing one with the symphony on June the 27th at the legislature, and then we're doing one in December. I thought you asked. There are so many. There are so many, because our music schools, particularly Grant McEwen, in respect of jazz music, is turning out such wonderful musicians. Our heels are being nipped at constantly by wonderful new players. There are so many of them that I hesitate to name any because they're all outstanding. You can hear them playing at the Yardbird Street on Tuesday nights, and our professional music community is continually being filled by these new young people coming up. The level of playing is far superior to what it was when I was starting. There are so many of them that it's amazing. There are a half a dozen. I did as part of the 60th anniversary of the Yardbird Suite, I did a celebration called Piano City, because we have so many good pianists in it. And there were so many that I had to leave off because there just wasn't time to have them on there. So I'm not going to give you a list because there's a long, long list, and they're all young and they're all fabulous. Sure. I get off the hook.
$10 a week is still good money.
No, inflation has set in. Thank you very much.